The world remembers names differently than it remembers deeds. Some called him Crevan Espane, Caomhan Macha. The unicorns, creatures whose intelligence surpassed that of most sentient beings, named him Fox, not for the color of his hair, which fell pale and fair past his shoulders, but for what foxes have always represented in the old tales: cunning, calculation, the ability to see paths through the forest that others cannot perceive. The Aen Elle knew him as Sage, Aen Severn, one of the knowing ones whose minds could trace the threads of what might come, who understood patterns in time and probability that escaped even other elves. He stood taller than most, very tall even for an elf, with a face that seemed gentle at rest. Yet those who met his eyes often sensed something beneath, a depth of age, knowledge, grief that had calcified into something harder over centuries. 400 years, more than 400 years, he had walked between the worlds, watched empires rise and crumble in what his people measured as mere seasons. The Aen Elle did not experience time as humans did. A decade passed like a summer. A century might feel like the turning of a few years. This was not metaphor. Their biology, their consciousness, operated on scales that made human urgency seem like the frantic scuttling of mayflies. And yet, even among his own people, Avallac'h was ancient. The knowing ones were rare even before the conjunction. They emerged unpredictably across generations. Elves born with minds that could perceive probability as texture, see time as landscape rather than linear path. Second sight, some called it, though the term inadequate. These sages did not see the future with clarity. They perceived patterns, trajectories, the shape of what might emerge from the confluence of present conditions. Most elves lived long. Sages lived longer. Whether this resulted from their abilities protecting them from danger or from some deeper connection between prophetic gifts, an extended lifespan remained unclear. What could be documented? By the time Avallac'h encountered Geralt of Rivia, he had already witnessed the slow extinction of the Ensigde, the hardening of human kingdoms, the transformation of magic from wild art into structured discipline. He had watched generations of human mages rise and fall, seen kingdoms fracture and reform, observed the gradual decline of his own people across multiple worlds. And through it all, he had waited, calculated, planned across timescales that would break human minds attempting to comprehend them. To understand the Fox, one must first understand the schism. The Aen Elle and Ensigde were once one people. Before the conjunction of the spheres tore reality apart, before monsters and humans flooded into the world that would become known as the continent, the elves controlled the Ardgaith, the gates between worlds. These were not metaphorical gates. They were real passages, ruptures in the fabric, between realities through which the elves could step from one world to another as simply as walking through a doorway. The technology or magic that powered them, perhaps both intertwined, allowed the Aen Elle to perceive worlds beyond their own, and open paths to reach them. They had used these gates for conquest. The pattern repeated across worlds: locate a reality through the Ardgath, send scouts, assess resources and resistance, then pour through in numbers sufficient to overwhelm whatever civilization already existed there. Find a world, step through, subjugate its inhabitants, drain its resources, enslave survivors. When a world had been bled dry or proved unsuitable, they opened the gate again and moved on to the next. This was not portrayed as evil in Aen Elle histories. It was simply how civilizations expanded, how power operated. The strong conquered the weak, the long-lived outlasted the brief, the intelligent subjugated the simple. Some of the elves used these gates to travel to a new world before the conjunction of the spheres. There they established their civilization in what they would call Tir na Lia, far from the ancestral lands. They became the Aen Elle, the elves of another world. Those who remained on the original world became the Ensigde. When the conjunction of the spheres came, that cataclysmic collision of realities roughly 1500 years before the time of Geralt of Rivia, everything changed. The gates closed, sealed. The Ardgaith ceased to function. The Aen Elle found themselves trapped in their adopted world, unable to return home, unable to continue their expansion across realities. The Ensigde discovered they were suddenly sharing their ancestral lands with an invasion they could not have anticipated. Humans poured through during the conjunction, refugees from their own dying world. And with the humans came creatures, monsters, beasts, entities from multiple realities colliding at once. The two branches of elvenkind were sundered. Communication became impossible. Each faced their own apocalypse. For the Aen Elle, the catastrophe was immediate and overwhelming. Humans bred faster than elves. An elven woman might bear one child in a lifetime. Human women bore multiple children across decades. Within a single human generation, they matched elven numbers. Within a few generations, they outnumbered them vastly. The mathematics were brutal and inexorable. Elven lifespans stretched centuries. They could afford to wait out most threats. But human population growth operated on scales the elves had never evolved to counter. Within decades, the humans had established kingdoms. Within a century, the elves were retreating to forests and mountains. Within 3 centuries, the Aen Elle had become second-class citizens in their own lands, pushed to the margins, hunted for sport by bored nobles, their culture dismissed as primitive by the very species that had learned magic from elven teachers. The conquerors had become the conquered. The long-lived had been overwhelmed by the brief and numerous. For the Aen Elle, the catastrophe was slower, but equally inevitable. Trapped in a single world, cut off from their ability to expand across realities, they faced a different mathematics of extinction. The scholars among them, the sages, the knowing ones, began to perceive the pattern: planetary cycles, orbital decay. The white frost approached, an ice age that would freeze their world as thoroughly as it would eventually freeze the continent and every other world in the multiverse. It was not a question of if, only when. Their calculations suggested 3,000 years, perhaps, maybe less. On the scale of human civilizations, an eternity. Empires would rise and fall dozens of times before the ice came. On the scale of elven consciousness, barely time to prepare. A few dozen generations. A brief window to solve an existential problem. This was the world Avallac'h had inherited, not the comfortable assumption of endless worlds to conquer, endless resources to exploit, but the cold mathematics of extinction approaching from multiple directions at once. The Aen Elle could not leave their world. The Aen Elle were being systematically destroyed on theirs, and eventually the white frost would come for everyone. The only solution: reopen the Ardgoth, restore the ability to step between worlds, escape before the ice arrived. But the gates remained sealed. No amount of conventional magic could breach them. Something more was needed, something like the Elder Blood. The Elder Blood did not occur naturally. This fact remains crucial to understanding what followed. The gene that humans would later call Aen Elle, that scholars would name the Lara gene, that prophecy would call Elder Blood, it was not a spontaneous mutation. It was the product of an extensive breeding program that spanned multiple generations of elven history. The Aen Elle sages had observed the unicorns. These beings possessed innate abilities to traverse worlds, to perceive and navigate the spaces between realities without requiring gates. The ability was biological, encoded in their very nature. The sages theorized that similar abilities could be replicated in elves, not through technology or ritual magic, but through selective breeding. By identifying individuals with rare source abilities, arranging their unions, tracking the inheritance patterns across generations, they might be able to concentrate and amplify these talents until they produced an individual capable of reopening the Ardgoth, of commanding the gates between worlds through will and blood alone. The program spanned centuries. Each generation they refined their understanding, identified which traits bred true, discovered which combinations amplified power, learned which bloodlines carried recessive variants that could express powerfully when paired correctly. The early generations involved trial and error. Sages would identify individuals with unusual source abilities, track how those abilities manifested in their children, document which pairings produced powerful offspring versus disappointments. Disappointments were common. Most children of powerful parents showed no particular gifts. The inheritance patterns proved far more complex than simple dominance. Multiple genes interacted in ways that took centuries to understand. Some bloodlines showed promise for 3 generations, then produced nothing. Others seemed ordinary until a recessive trait suddenly expressed powerfully in the 4th or 5th generation. The sages learned patience, tracking dozens of family lines simultaneously, waiting for the patterns to emerge. They studied probability and genealogy with equal intensity, built mathematical models attempting to predict which unions would produce desired results, failed repeatedly, adjusted their models, tried again, the work consumed generations of scholars. Sages dedicated entire lifetimes to tracking a single family line, passing their research to successors, building on accumulated knowledge that spanned centuries. They treated bloodlines as equations to be solved. Marriage became mathematics. Children became data points in calculations too vast for most minds to comprehend. Love was irrelevant. Compatibility beyond genetics meaningless. Survival was everything. Some among the Aen Elle objected, raised concerns about treating their own people as breeding stock, questioned whether survival purchased at the cost of individual autonomy was worth having. These objections were noted, documented, and dismissed. The White Frost approached. Extinction cared nothing for ethical qualms. The choice was simple: control reproduction to maximize survival chances, or allow random chance to determine whether anyone would live. And gradually, across generations of careful cultivation, the gene emerged, concentrated, potent, capable of extraordinary feats of magic relating to time and space. Bloodlines that had shown modest source abilities in isolation began producing remarkable talents when crossed deliberately. Children who could perceive probability patterns, manipulate space more easily than their parents had manipulated simple elements, sense the thin places between worlds where the old gates had once stood. Each generation brought them closer. Each success suggested the next combination to try. The mathematics of genetics slowly yielding to patience and accumulated observation. The program succeeded beyond its architect's original designs. Lara Dorren ap Shiadal emerged as the culmination of generations of careful genetic engineering, daughter of Oberon Murkatak, king of the Aen Elle, bearer of the elder blood in its most potent form yet achieved, and she was promised to Avallac'h. The union had been planned, presumably for years, possibly for decades before Lara reached maturity. Among the Aen Elle, such arrangements were not matters of individual preference, but of necessity. The survival of the species, the fulfillment of prophecy, the reopening of the gates, these concerns superseded personal desire. Every child born to powerful bloodlines understood their purpose from early age. They were bred for function. Their lives were not their own, but belonged to the future of the race. Lara Dorren was intended to be Avallac'h's bride. Their union represented the next step in the program. Her concentrated elder blood, combined with his sage abilities and long lifespan, might produce offspring even more powerful than their parents. The gene would be stabilized, strengthened, made permanent in the bloodline. Whether Avallac'h loved Lara Dorren in the way humans conceptualize love remains unknown. The Aen Elle did not speak of love the way humans did. They experienced attachment, certainly, partnership, respect, but the intensity of human romantic passion, the brevity that made each moment precious, this was foreign to beings who measured relationships in centuries. What can be documented from his later actions? He valued her beyond measure. She represented, in a sense, the answer to the equation his people had been solving for generations, the variable that would allow them to calculate survival. She was the key to the gates, the path forward, the future made flesh. Then the variables shifted violently. The conjunction had not merely sealed the gates, it had deposited new players onto the board. Realities colliding meant refugees from multiple dying worlds, suddenly sharing space with confused original inhabitants. Humans arrived on the continent in chaos, fleeing their own world's destruction. They came in waves, desperate, armed, numerous. They had no homes to return to. Only forward survival remained possible. Among the humans, mages, sorcerers who wielded power in ways different from elven magic. Where elves shape magic through understanding and patience, through study that spanned decades, human mages worked with raw force and instinct. Their lifespans were brief. They had no time for patient mastery. They burned bright and fast, but they were effective, crude but potent, and they learned quickly, adapting elven techniques to their own frantic needs. One such human was named Crevan Espane. The specifics of how Lara Dorren encountered him remain unclear. The conjunction had scattered populations across the continent. Lara found herself on the continent's side of reality when the gates sealed. Whether she had been traveling, studying, or fleeing, the records do not specify. What occurred between Lara and Crevan, whether it was love, rebellion, political calculation, or something else entirely, resulted in a relationship that shattered centuries of planning. From the Aen Elle perspective, this was not romance. It was theft, betrayal on a scale that threatened racial extinction. The humans had stolen the Lara gene, the product of generations of careful breeding, the key to reopening the gates, the salvation of the elven race, now impregnated by a human, carrying a half-human child. The elder blood diluted, corrupted, lost to the very species that had doomed the Aen Elle to subjugation. Every calculation the sages had made assumed the gene would remain in elven hands, controlled, guided, used for its intended purpose of elven survival. Lara's choice, if it was choice, meant the gene would now propagate through human bloodlines. Unpredictable, uncontrolled, spreading through populations hostile to elves, diluting across generations in ways impossible to predict or manage. From a purely strategic perspective, it was catastrophic. Crevan was murdered. Whether by Aen Elle agents, insider rivals, or human xenophobes remains unclear. Multiple factions had motivation. The details dissolved into myth and rumor. Lara Dorren died, giving birth to their daughter Rhiannon. The circumstances suggest complications, though whether natural or deliberately induced, cannot be verified from surviving accounts. The child survived, a half-elf bearing concentrated elder blood. The gene persisted, passed into a human lineage. For Avallac'h, this represented a loss whose dimensions cannot be fully measured. The intended bride, gone, dead at the hands of a chaotic universe that had stripped him of the future he had been promised. The genetic program derailed, centuries of work scattered across hostile populations. The prophecy seemingly broken. How could the Aen Elle be saved if the key to their salvation now lay in human hands? And perhaps, though this remains speculation, something personal had been taken from him. Whether he had loved Lara in some fashion, or simply valued what she represented, she was gone. Murdered for loving a human. Her death a waste, her potential unrealized, her purpose unfulfilled. The Aen Elle adjusted their calculations. The child of Lara and Crevan still carried elder blood, albeit diluted. The gene persisted. Somewhere in the future, if the line could be tracked and managed, another bearer might emerge with sufficient power to reopen the gates. But the original plan had collapsed. Instead of working with known variables in a closed system, the Aen Elle now faced the prospect of monitoring an expanding family tree through hostile human territory, across centuries, waiting for the right combination to appear, waiting for genetics and chance to align again. Avallac'h adjusted his calculations. The problem had become exponentially more complex, but complexity did not equal impossibility. He had time, centuries, and patience was something his people had evolved to master. Ithlane Egli ep Avenian had lived generations before Avallac'h met Geralt of Rivia, but her words echoed across centuries with the weight of truth that would not diminish. An elven prophetess gifted with second sight far beyond even the typical sage, she had foreseen the shape of the end. Her visions were recorded, studied, interpreted by generations of scholars, attempting to extract meaning from symbolic language. The prophecy spoke of apocalypse and salvation intertwined. The world would end in ice. The white frost would consume everything, but salvation existed, contingent on specific conditions being met. The child of elder blood would open the gates, or perhaps the child of that child. The language shifted between interpretations, but someone bearing the elder blood, at the proper time, with proper guidance, could reopen the Ardgoth and allow the elves to escape before the ice claimed their worlds. The prophecy also spoke of fire and blood, of the time of the sword and axe, of destruction that would precede or accompany salvation. Whether these were warnings or simply descriptions of the path that must be walked remained unclear. Prophecy resisted simple interpretation. It described patterns, not prescriptions. Fulfilled prophecy might look nothing like what those seeking to fulfill it had imagined. Avallac'h became one of the primary keepers of Ithlin's words. He studied the prophecy not as mystical revelation but as roadmap, a set of conditions that must be met, variables that must align, a problem to be solved through patience, planning, and precise manipulation of bloodlines across centuries. Tracking Lara's descendants became essential. The gene persisted in Rhiannon, Lara's half-human daughter. From there it scattered across the human kingdoms of the continent. The line passed through generations of humans who knew nothing of the inheritance they carried, who thought of themselves as ordinary, who lived and died without understanding the power sleeping in their blood. Some descendants died without children. Others had many, branching the tree in unpredictable directions. The gene could skip generations, remaining latent, invisible to anyone not specifically tracking inheritance patterns across centuries. The Nordling mages became aware of the elder blood through their own research and study. They attempted their own tracking, their own manipulation of bloodlines, but they made errors. They identified one type of the gene but failed to recognize the latent variant and the activator gene. They tried to control the breeding through political marriages, treating carriers like valuable livestock, but lacked the Aen Elle's centuries of genetic knowledge. Both human mages and Aen Elle sages found themselves racing toward the same goal, through different methods and with vastly different timescales of planning. Control the bloodline, produce the prophesied child, determine the shape of the future before the ice came for them all. The human mages thought in terms of generations. 3, 4, 5 generations of careful marriage alliances to produce the right heir. To them, this seemed patient, long-term. Avallac'h thought in terms of centuries. He had already been watching the bloodline for longer than any human mage had been alive. He could afford to wait for the perfect convergence. And somewhere in this tangled web of genetic calculation and prophetic interpretation, Avallac'h waited, watched, monitored. He could travel between worlds, one of the few who still could through methods he did not share. He maintained contact with the Aen Elle while observing developments on the continent. He could track the bloodline as it fragmented and consolidated across generations. He could wait, because waiting was something his people had evolved to do well, because patience measured in centuries came naturally to beings who experienced decades as humans experience seasons. The mathematics remained complex, the variables numerous, but the problem was not unsolvable. Eventually, given sufficient time and careful intervention at critical moments, the bloodline would produce another bear like Lara Dorren. Eventually, Cirilla would be born. When Avallac'h finally approached Geralt of Rivia, he chose his location with the care of someone who had planned the encounter for years. A cave beneath Mount Gorgon. Remote, defensible, symbolic. The druids delivered their message to Geralt through intermediaries. Instructions that reeked of ritual and testing. The Witcher must enter unarmed, must abandon all weapons, all sharp iron, all sharp thoughts, must prove himself capable of humility and sacrifice. Geralt complied, descending into darkness, seeking knowledge of Ciri's location, desperate enough to follow even cryptic instructions from beings he did not entirely trust. There he encountered Avallac'h for the first time. The sage was painting when Geralt found him. Not any ordinary painting, but a mural of a purple bison on the cave wall. Prehistoric art, or what would appear to be prehistoric art to future human scholars. Avallac'h explained with obvious amusement. Human scientists wandered through caves for years searching for traces of primitive humans. When they found paintings like this, they would believe humans had lived here for centuries, making the world rightfully theirs by ancient claim. Proof that their ancestors belonged to this land. Every race deserves some roots, he noted, including humans, whose roots should be sought in large trees. He paused, clearly pleased with himself. A funny pun, was it not? Worthy of an epigram. The painting was fresh. Avallac'h admitted that in 3 or 4 days the colors would fade due to salt exuded by the wall, making the art look authentically ancient. Human scholars would, he swore, wet themselves with joy when they discovered it. Not one would see through the deception. Geralt pointed out that Avallac'h would likely sign his work. Vanity would not allow otherwise. The elf laughed, dry and knowing. Admitted it freely. He had already signed the cave painting, right there, though the symbol looked like a dragonfly rather than letters, and a diagram denoting his name in a script humans would not recognize. Then, unprompted, he mused about adding other prehistoric touches to make the forgery more convincing. Perhaps depict the anatomical features of these ancient hunters with generous proportions. Their forebears had possessed remarkable endowments, but their descendants had been left with vestigial remnants. The paint was still fresh. He could add those details if it pleased him. This moment, brief as it was, revealed something crucial about Avallac'h's character. 4 centuries old, bearer of prophetic gifts, keeper of the fate of the elven race, and he was painting fake prehistoric art to confuse future scholars and joking about adding exaggerated genitalia to the figures because he found it amusing. Because he could. the power to manipulate human understanding of their own history, to rewrite the past through careful forgery, to leave evidence that would shape academic discourse for generations, treated as a game, an elaborate prank that would echo across centuries. Foxes were tricksters. This was the fox at play. After establishing this tone, Avallac'h identified Geralt by name without introduction, knew he was a witcher, spoke of Cirilla, revealing knowledge of Geralt's quest. Then he launched into a lengthy discourse on the superiority of elves to humans. Not casual prejudice, but systematic argument. Humans were crude, short-lived, responsible for the devastation of their own original world. They bred like vermin, overwhelmed through numbers what they could not match through quality. They learned magic from elves, then claimed superiority. They conquered through quantity and called it civilization. That Lara Dorren had chosen a human was, in this worldview, an incomprehensible betrayal. An act so irrational it suggested either madness or corruption. Geralt listened without arguing extensively. He had not come to debate philosophy, but to find Ciri. After laying this philosophical groundwork, establishing his contempt for humanity, while simultaneously demonstrating his power through the depth of knowledge he possessed about Geralt's quest, Avallac'h opened a portal. The cave wall shifted. The mural of the purple bison served as camouflage, protecting what lay behind. He led Geralt through to Tir na Bea Arain, the cemetery where Lara Dorren's memorial stood. Not even a tomb, a cenotaph, an empty monument to someone whose body had been lost or destroyed. Lara's remains were not here, only memory preserved in marble. In this place of memory and grief, Avallac'h revealed Ithlin's prophecy in its fuller context. He explained the white frost, the inevitable extinction approaching from the future, the ice that would consume all worlds eventually. He connected Cirilla to the prophecy, establishing her as the swallow, whose offspring would determine whether salvation remained possible. He spoke of the elder blood with the precision of someone who had spent centuries studying it, how it functioned, what it could accomplish, why Ciri mattered not for who she was, but for what she carried. And then, having provided this context, he warned Geralt explicitly, do not pursue Ciri. If Geralt continued seeking her, he would lose her forever. The Witcher's interference would disrupt what must occur. Destiny had its own path. Geralt should step aside and allow events to unfold as prophecy dictated. The warning carried the weight of genuine foresight. Avallac'h, gifted with second sight, perceiving probability across timelines, stated with apparent certainty that Geralt's continued pursuit would end in loss. Geralt, being Geralt, ignored the warning entirely, and continued his search with redoubled intensity. Avallac'h had almost certainly expected exactly this response. A witcher who abandoned his child by law of surprise based on one conversation with an elf would be useless. The warning itself might have been test, provocation, or simply fulfillment of obligation to state what he had foreseen. The fox laid his traps in layers. Even warnings served multiple purposes. When Cirilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon stumbled through the Tower of the Swallow, fleeing from Leo Bonhart and Nilfgaardian agents who had hunted her across the continent, she found herself transported not to safety, but to Tir na Lea. The tower was a gate point, a weak spot in reality where the fabric between worlds remained thin. The conjunction had sealed most passages, but some structures remained where crossing became possible under specific conditions. Ciri, manifesting her elder blood abilities under extreme duress, had opened a path without understanding what she was doing or where it would lead. Avallac'h had placed a magical barrier around the access point on the Aen Elle side. The barrier was selective, designed to allow entry from the continent but prevent exit back. A one-way door, a trap disguised as escape. Ciri could enter the Aen Elle realm. She could not leave it. She had been imprisoned the moment she crossed the threshold. For the first 8 days, she wandered the capital city as an enforced guest. Tir na Lea was beautiful in the way ancient civilizations could be when they had centuries to perfect architecture, when buildings were designed to last millennia, when art could develop uninterrupted by war or conquest. But underneath the beauty, Ciri discovered the truth of the Aen Elle. Enslaved humans served throughout the city, not employees, not servants with contracts and wages, slaves, property, beings treated as less than elven dogs. She found a ravine filled with thousands of human bodies, discarded, thrown away when they ceased to be useful. The Aen Elle had not arrived in an empty world. This world had indigenous inhabitants, humans. The Aen Elle had exterminated or enslaved them all, reducing entire civilizations to livestock. The unicorns had fought against this. That was why the Aen Elle hunted them, killed them, why Eridan's Red Riders made sport of slaughtering creatures whose intelligence exceeded most sentient beings. The unicorns had opposed genocide. They remembered when the Aen Elle were merely visitors. They remembered when they became conquerors. They could not forgive. Ciri observed all this while trapped, unable to escape, unable to return home, waiting for someone to explain why she was here. When Avallac'h finally revealed himself to Ciri, he stopped mid-sentence upon seeing her face. She carried Lara Dorren's eyes, green, distinctive, inherited across the bloodline. The girl standing before him resembled his long-dead intended bride, with the unsettling precision of genetic inheritance expressing across centuries. For a moment, perhaps the only moment in centuries, Avallac'h appeared at a loss. He looked at Ciri, seeing through her to someone else, someone lost, someone who had chosen a human over him and died for that choice. He left without speaking, disappeared for an entire week while, presumably, he recalculated his approach. The appearance of Lara's eyes in Ciri's face had disrupted whatever plan he had prepared, made the task personal in ways he had perhaps not anticipated. When he returned, he brought a proposal, clinical, transactional, stripped of emotion he may or may not have felt. Ciri would bear a child with King Oberon Murcitash. Once pregnancy was confirmed, she would be free to return to her world and her time. The child would carry concentrated elder blood capable of reopening the gates and saving the Aen Elle from the white frost. He framed this as obligation, as debt. Lara had been stolen by a human. Ciri, as Lara's descendant, owed recompense. She would provide what Lara had denied them, a child of pure elder blood, born to serve Aen Elle purposes. He framed it as limited cooperation, a transaction, one child in exchange for freedom, one pregnancy in exchange for escape. He did not mention that time flowed differently between worlds, that years might pass on the continent while days passed here, that everyone she knew might age or die while she remained trapped. He didn't mention Eridan's true intentions, or perhaps he didn't yet know them himself. Ciri refused at first, obviously, demanded to be released, threatened to find her own way out. But there was no other escape. She tried, tested the barrier from every angle. It held perfectly. Avallac'h had designed it well. Days passed, then weeks. Ciri remained trapped, watching the enslaved humans serve their elven masters, seeing bodies discarded in ravines, understanding slowly that she was alone in a world where her life had value only as breeding stock. Eventually, faced with no alternative, seeing no other path, she agreed. What choice existed, really? Stay imprisoned forever or cooperate with the hope of eventual release? She agreed to try to bear Oberon's child. King Oberon Murcitash was, by this time, somewhere over 650 years old. Even among long-lived elves, this represented extraordinary age. Most elves lived centuries. Few reached 600. Fewer still remained functional beyond that threshold. Oberon had become, like many elves of extreme age, profoundly tired. The weariness that came from outliving everyone he had once known, from watching civilizations rise and fall like seasons, from existing so long that novelty had ceased to exist. He was also functionally impotent. Age, weariness, centuries of existence, whatever the cause, Oberon could no longer perform the act required to conceive a child. Multiple nights passed. Ciri submitted to the attempt, presented herself as required by the agreement. Oberon tried and failed repeatedly. The scenes were profoundly uncomfortable. A young woman allowing an ancient king to use her body in futile attempts at procreation, night after night, while her freedom depended on success. The architecture of the arrangement revealed itself through details. Ciri was provided a room in the palace. Beautiful, certainly. Furnished with luxury that exceeded anything she had known. Silks from worlds the Aen Elle had conquered, art from civilizations they had extinguished, comfort purchased with genocide. She was given freedom of movement within limits, could ride her mare Kelpie in designated areas. could explore gardens where enslaved humans tended plants whose names she did not recognize, could observe the Aen Elle going about their ancient routines as if she did not exist, except when night came. Then Oberon summoned her, not with force or threat, simply expectation. She would come because she had agreed, because cooperation was the price of eventual freedom, because no other path existed. Oberon was not cruel, not brutal. He possessed none of Leo Bonhart's sadism, none of the casual violence Ciri had endured at other hands. He was simply very old and very tired, and going through motions that no longer worked. He treated Ciri with the distant politeness one might show a valuable broodmare, acknowledged her presence, spoke to her occasionally about irrelevant matters, made efforts that his body could not complete. He despised humans, made no secret of this, viewed them as little better than intelligent animals, creatures that bred rapidly and destroyed everything they touched. But she carried the elder blood. That genetic inheritance granted her value despite her contaminated humanity. Function mattered. Personhood did not. The nights passed in futility. Oberon growing increasingly frustrated with his own limitations. Ciri enduring what she had agreed to endure. Both trapped in an arrangement neither wanted, both going through motions that satisfied no one. And she endured it because the alternative was remaining imprisoned forever. Because Avallac'h had promised that after conception she would be freed. Because hope, however thin, was better than despair. She didn't ask herself whether the promise would be kept. She had no choice but to believe it would be. The alternative was madness. Eredin Breac, general of the Red Riders, commander of the hunters who raided other worlds for slaves and sport, provided King Oberon with a solution, a potion, an aphrodisiac, a substance designed to overcome the king's limitations and allow him to perform what age had rendered impossible. Whether Eredin intended murder or merely miscalculated dosage remained ambiguous. The book suggests he appeared genuinely surprised when informed of the result. The potion was meant to help, to facilitate the breeding program, to allow the plan to proceed. Oberon drank the potion Eredin had provided, and died. Ciri found him in his chambers, the vial fallen from his hand. He died relatively quickly, surrounded by luxury, alone except for the girl he had been trying to impregnate. She stayed with him until the end. Whatever her feelings about the situation, whatever violation she felt had been committed against her, she didn't leave him to die alone. Then she took the opportunity to attempt escape. Eredin confronted her at the docks, demanding to know where she thought she was going. Ciri told him directly, Oberon was dead. He had overdosed on the stimulant Eredin provided. Whether accident or intention, the result was the same. Eredin shook off his surprise quickly, lunged at her. The boat rocked dangerously. Then he revealed what Avallac'h had not told her. They were never going to let her go. The promise of freedom had been lie. Even if she had successfully conceived, they would have kept her until the child was born, then likely killed her to prevent the elder blood from spreading further through unpredictable human bloodlines. The urgency had been false. The white frost was still millennia away. The Aen Elle wanted the gates reopened not to escape extinction, but to resume conquest. Everything Avallac'h had said was manipulation, pretty lies to secure cooperation. With Oberon dead and Eredin in power, the careful arrangement had collapsed entirely. New king, new priorities. The pretense of limited cooperation no longer necessary. Ciri fought her way free, injured Eredin, escaped to where the unicorns waited, having finally decided to help her despite their justified hatred of her species. The wild hunt pursued. Eredin transformed from general to king to predator, chasing Ciri across worlds and time, determined to capture her and extract what the Aen Elle required by force since cooperation had failed. And somewhere in the chaos, Avallac'h's calculations had shattered into variables beyond prediction. Whether Avallac'h had genuinely intended to release Ciri, or whether Eredin spoke the truth cannot be proven from surviving accounts. What can be documented? The consequences had begun to compound beyond anyone's control. Ciri had been imprisoned through deception, her bodily autonomy violated through coercion and false promise. She had been treated as breeding stock, her personhood dismissed, her suffering deemed acceptable cost for elven survival. Oberon was dead. Whatever his complicity in the arrangement, whatever his feelings about humans, he had been king. His death destabilized Aen Elle politics, created succession crisis, allowed Eredin to seize power through violence rather than legitimate transition. Eredin had claimed the throne and transformed the Wild Hunt from tool of exploration into terror. What had been raiding parties became something darker. Hunt for sport, hunt for slaves, hunt because they could. The careful plans Avallac'h had constructed across centuries, the mathematical precision with which he had guided events, had shattered into chaos. Ciri had learned the true Aen Elle intention, not merely survival, but genocide. Not escape from the White Frost, but preparation for renewed conquest, using her child's power to open gates and resume the extinction of other worlds' populations. She had escaped from Tir Nalia, but the Wild Hunt pursued her relentlessly across worlds and through time. Eredin would not stop, could not stop. His kingship depended on delivering what the Aen Elle required. His pride demanded capturing what had escaped him, and Avallac'h found himself in a shifted landscape where the tool he had tried to control had become a refugee, where his former allies, if they had ever truly been allies, had become her hunters, where the mathematics of planning had collided with the chaos of consequence. The problem had grown far more complex than any calculation could solve. What occurred in the years that followed depends on which timeline one follows, which accounts one believes, what one considers canon versus alteration. At some point, through mechanisms not entirely clear, Avallac'h became Ciri's protector rather than her captor. He began teaching her to control her powers instead of forcing her to breed. He trained her to master the elder blood abilities that had manifested chaotically, helping her survive the Wild Hunt's pursuit. This represents either genuine growth, pragmatic adaptation, or a longer game than initially apparent. Multiple interpretations exist. Perhaps he genuinely came to care for her, saw in her not just Lara's descendant, but an individual deserving of agency. Perhaps he recognized that forcing her cooperation had failed, and adapted to recruit her willingly. Perhaps he had been playing a longer game all along, using Oberon's plan to maneuver Ciri into position, while secretly intending different outcome. Perhaps all three simultaneously. Motivations need not be simple. 400 years of accumulated agenda could produce contradictory impulses operating in parallel. He possessed a laboratory filled with genealogical charts, tracking the elder blood through generations. Detailed notes attempting to understand and replicate the Lara gene. Evidence that even while protecting or teaching Ciri, he continued studying her, analyzing her, documenting her abilities with clinical precision. Moments existed where he seemed to genuinely care for her welfare, defended her from danger, sacrificed himself to keep her safe from the Wild Hunt, accepting a curse that transformed him into Uma, a tortured creature barely clinging to life, rather than allow Eredin to capture her. Moments existed where his interest appeared clinical, the observation of a valuable specimen, references in his notes about genetic potential, breeding compatibility, power measurements, language that treated Ciri as subject rather than person. One elven woman, claiming to be his lover, stated that he secretly loathed Ciri, despised her human blood, resented his dependence on her. The source was biased, perhaps jealous, certainly hostile, but the statement resonated with Avallac'h's earlier contempt for humanity. The contradictions resist simple resolution. Perhaps Avallac'h himself no longer knew clearly, after 4 centuries of accumulated planning, what he felt versus what he calculated. Perhaps the fox had lost himself in his own schemes. What remained clear, he continued manipulating events toward outcomes he deemed necessary. Protection and manipulation were not mutually exclusive. He could save Ciri's life while simultaneously ensuring she remained positioned to fulfill prophecy. The fox laid traps even in his apparent benevolence. To comprehend the scale of Avallac'h's calculations requires understanding how the Aen Elle experienced time and probability. A sage with prophetic abilities did not see the future with perfect clarity. Second sight functioned more like perceiving patterns, trajectories, probability clusters. Multiple potential futures existed simultaneously, collapsing into actualization only when specific conditions aligned. Combine this with the elven experience of time, where decades passed like seasons and centuries like years, and strategy operated on scales incomprehensible to humans. A human planner thinks in years. A skilled human strategist might plan a decade ahead. the most sophisticated human institutions, kingdoms, and magical lodges, planned perhaps a generation or two into the future. An elven sage could construct plans that spanned centuries, could initiate events that would not bear fruit for lifetimes, could wait patiently for genetics and probability to align, knowing that time was ally rather than enemy. Consider the mathematics of maintaining the Elder Blood program for over 1,500 years since the original conjunction. Since Lara Dorren's death, the gene had to be monitored continuously across hostile territories. Every branch of her family tree tracked, every marriage recorded, every child's abilities tested surreptitiously for signs of active inheritance versus latent carriage. The tree expanded exponentially. Lara had one child. Rhiannon had children. Each of Rhiannon's children had children. Each generation, the branches multiplied. Within 10 generations, thousands of descendants existed, most unaware they carried anything unusual in their blood. Which branches carried active genes versus latent? Which combinations produced carriers versus dead ends? How did magical ability correlate with inheritance? Did training affect expression? Did trauma activate latent abilities? The logistics of tracking this across centuries, through wars and plagues and political upheavals, across dozens of human kingdoms that rose and fell, required resources and patience beyond human comprehension. The Aen Elle maintained this program for 1,500 years. Multiple sages contributed across generations. Knowledge was preserved, passed down, refined. Avallac'h inherited this accumulated wisdom and expanded upon it. Lara Dorren's rebellion had occurred only a century and a half prior to Ciri's birth. On human timescales, ancient history. On elven timescales, barely time enough to adjust to the new variables she had introduced. The gene had been stolen by humanity. That theft had occurred so recently that the elves directly responsible for the original breeding program might still be alive, still remember Lara as a child, still grieve what had been lost. Avallac'h had known Lara personally, had been promised her hand. The loss was not abstract historical fact, but personal memory. His approach to Ciri was not merely about one girl. It was the culmination of 1,500 years of tracking, centuries of calculation compressing down to one opportunity. When Ciri was born, the sages recognized immediately. The gene had expressed with unusual strength, active rather than latent, concentrated rather than diluted. This child, properly guided, could reopen the gates, but she was surrounded by a protective family, witchers, sorceresses. Reaching her required patience, waiting for circumstances to align, maneuvering events so she would eventually come to them rather than requiring the Aen Elle to extract her by force. The fall of Cintra, Ciri's flight, her training at Kaer Morhen, her capture by various factions. Avallac'h likely observed it all, waiting for the moment when she would be desperate enough, isolated enough, to accept transportation to Tir Nalia as rescue rather than trap. Failure meant starting the calculation over, waiting another few centuries for genetics to align again, for another bearer of sufficient power to emerge from Lara's scattered bloodline, risking that the White Frost would arrive before another suitable carrier appeared. The pressure under which his decisions operated was immense. Not personal pressure, but mathematical. The weight of racial extinction, the knowledge that every choice could mean the difference between survival and annihilation of the entire Aen Elle civilization. This does not excuse his treatment of Ciri, does not justify imprisoning her, deceiving her, coercing her, but it contextualizes why someone capable of compassion might choose actions that demonstrated none, when survival of the many required sacrifice of the few. And when one possessed both authority and ability to make that calculation, moral clarity became dangerously easy. Humans live 70 to 80 years, if fortunate. Their concept of urgency operated on scales of months and years. Plans that extended beyond one lifetime remained abstract. They experienced time viscerally. Each day mattered. Each week was significant. A year represented a substantial portion of expected lifespan. Waiting decades for plans to mature seemed impossibly patient. The Aen Seide, after 1,500 years of defeat, had learned bitter lessons about time. Their longest-term planning involved hoping their grandchildren might face slightly less discrimination, that perhaps in a few generations, humans would grow less hostile. They had been ground down until survival itself constituted victory. The Aen Elle had never lost. They viewed themselves as superior through empirical observation. Longer lived, greater magical ability, civilizations that endured millennia without collapse. Conquering other worlds had been their heritage, subjugating lesser species their natural right. The idea that they might owe humans consideration seemed absurd from this perspective. Humans were brief, crude, violent. They destroyed their own world, then invaded others. They bred like parasites and overwhelmed through sheer numbers. When Avallac'h looked at Ciri, he saw genetic inheritance first, potential second, a tool whose value derived from usefulness in fulfilling prophecy. Her suffering, measured against the survival of the entire Aen Elle race, constituted acceptable cost. Her autonomy meant nothing against extinction. Her personhood disappeared beneath the weight of what she represented. She was not Cirilla, individual deserving of choice. She was the elder blood, resource to be exploited before it was lost. This calculation was not evil from his frame of reference. It was rational. The same calculation human generals make when sending soldiers to die for strategic objectives. The same logic empires use when extracting resources from colonies. The same mathematics that justify sacrificing individuals for collective benefit. The difference lay in the scale, and in whose suffering counted as acceptable. Avallac'h, calculating across centuries, treating individuals as variables in equations too vast for human comprehension, made the same fundamental error that all long-term planners risk, forgetting that statistics are composed of people, that each data point represents a life, that every variable has consciousness, feels pain, deserves consideration beyond utility. The mathematics of consequence proved more complex than the mathematics of planning. But by the time he realized this, if he ever did, the cost had already been paid. Among Avallac'h's roles beyond sage and schemer, keeper of knowledge that might otherwise be lost, his laboratory contained more than genealogical charts and elder blood research, magic theory spanning millennia, dimensional physics describing how realities intersected and diverged, the mathematics of probability and prophecy, the full history of the elves before the conjunction, preserved when much else had been forgotten. He was scholar as much as strategist, perhaps more. His survival across centuries might owe as much to accumulated knowledge as to prophetic ability. In one encounter recorded during Geralt's journey, the Witcher discovered Avallac'h engaged in what appeared to be academic prank. The sage was painting prehistoric cave art, creating what would appear to future human scholars as evidence of ancient human habitation. When questioned, Avallac'h explained with obvious amusement his intention. Human scientists would search caves for millennia, desperate for traces of their own prehistory. When they found these paintings, they would celebrate, proof that humans had lived here for thousands of years, making the world rightfully theirs by ancient claim. Academic careers would be built on this evidence. Textbooks written, museums established, all based on forgery. Art he had created specifically to mislead, because he found it amusing. This moment revealed humor, playfulness, a kind of long-view pranksterism that came from having lived long enough that misleading scholars centuries in the future seemed entertaining rather than pointless. He joked about adding exaggerated anatomical features to the prehistoric hunters, mused that their forebears possessed impressive endowments, while their descendants had been left with the vestigial remnants. Entirely unnecessary embellishment, but he was clearly enjoying himself. The fox at play, weaponizing knowledge, manipulating perception of history as elaborate jest. It also demonstrated how knowledge could be obscured or manufactured. If he could falsify prehistory for amusement, what else might he have falsified for strategic purposes? Which historical accounts might he have altered? Which records destroyed or preserved according to agenda? The keeper of knowledge was also the manipulator of knowledge. The scholar was also the forger. Truth and deception intertwined in ways that made distinguishing between them impossible without independent verification. One consequence of Avallac'h's strategies remained tragically underexamined: what his plans meant for the Enseide. The prophecy spoke of saving elves from the White Frost. Avallac'h framed forcing Ciri into breeding as racial solidarity. Elven survival required Ciri's cooperation. Her resistance meant condemning the Enseide along with the Aen Elle to extinction, but the Enseide had no representation in these plans. No agency, no consultation. The Aen Elle made decisions on their behalf without ever asking what the Enseide wanted. For 1500 years, the Enseide had been hunted, subjugated, pushed to the margins, their culture eroded, their language dismissed as primitive, their magic considered inferior to human sorcery developed from elven teachings. They had been reduced to second-class citizens at best, prey for sport at worst, and the Aen Elle solution was to eventually reopen the gates, bring the Aen Elle through to Tir Nalia or to new worlds, and resume conquest with refreshed numbers, resume the extinction of other worlds' indigenous populations, resume slavery on industrial scale, resume everything the Aen Elle had done to this world's humans. The Aen Elle would be expected to participate, to be grateful for rescue, to assist in subjugating and exterminating whatever species they encountered next. Their centuries of experience living alongside humans, of mixed communities and families, of children born to mixed marriages, all of this would be dismissed as corruption, contamination, evidence of how far they had fallen rather than adaptation to new circumstances. Avallac'h's mathematics failed to account for the possibility that the Aen Elle might not want salvation on Aen Elle terms, that after 1500 years of learning to coexist with humans, however imperfectly, they might have developed different values, that seeing the consequences of conquest from the receiving end might have changed their perspective on whether conquest was justified, that being saved by those who viewed them as lesser might be worse than choosing their own fate. But these variables never entered his equations. The Aen Elle were objects to be rescued, not partners to be consulted. Their opinions were irrelevant. Only their genetic heritage and their elder blood carriers mattered. Ithlin's words contained a contradiction Avallac'h never fully resolved, possibly never attempted to resolve. The prophecy spoke of the world being reborn, of the seed that would not sprout but burst into flame, of salvation through the child of elder blood, who would open the gates and allow escape before the ice consumed everything. But it also spoke of the time of the sword and axe, of madness and contempt, of blood soaking the earth and fire consuming the sky, of destruction preceding or accompanying rebirth. Taken together, these images suggested that the path to salvation ran through devastation, that rebirth required death, that the gates would not open cleanly but through catastrophe. Avallac'h treated the prophecy as a problem to be solved through control, identify the child of elder blood, secure cooperation or compliance, guide events toward reopening the gates, evacuate before the white frost arrived, survival achieved through careful planning and precise execution. But prophecy resisted control. The more rigidly one attempted to force fulfillment along predetermined paths, the more likely unforeseen consequences emerged. Prophecy described patterns, not prescriptions. It showed what would happen, not what must be done to make it happen. By interpreting the prophecy as requiring control of the elder bloodbearer, by trapping Ciri, by attempting forced breeding, Avallac'h might have contributed to the very chaos the prophecy described. The seed that would burst into flame, perhaps that was the consequence of trying to control power that would not be controlled. The fire and blood were not obstacles to be overcome, but results of the attempt to manage destiny. The time of the sword and axe might not describe external threats, but the violence inherent in forcing prophecy toward specific fulfillment. This possibility that his methods were generating the catastrophe the prophecy warned about rather than preventing it seems not to have occurred to Avallac'h, or if it did, he dismissed it as acceptable cost. Control was his answer to everything. Plan carefully enough, manipulate precisely enough, wait patiently enough, and even prophecy could be managed. The fox believed he could outthink destiny itself. The unicorns called him Fox. This was not affection, not respect. Identification of essential nature accompanied by warning to others of their kind. The unicorns were intelligent beings capable of world travel, their minds operating on frequencies that most other species could not perceive. They had existed in the Aen Elle world long before the elves arrived, through the gates they would later lose the ability to use. When the Aen Elle first appeared, the unicorns observed with curiosity rather than hostility. New beings capable of speech and reason, potential for exchange, understanding, perhaps even friendship between species capable of comprehending each other. The Aen Elle cultivated this initial goodwill deliberately, presented themselves as refugees seeking sanctuary, explorers interested in knowledge, partners rather than conquerors. They asked the unicorns about their abilities. How did they traverse between worlds? What allowed them to perceive and navigate the spaces between realities? Pure academic interest, they claimed. Mutual benefit through shared understanding. The unicorns, having no concept of the depths to which beings might deceive, shared what they knew, demonstrated their abilities, explained the mechanics as far as they understood them, helped the elves study the phenomenon. They had been tricked into helping research that would allow the Aen Elle to replicate their gifts through genetic engineering, into providing the foundational knowledge that made the Elder Blood program possible. By the time they understood Aen Elle intentions, understood what use would be made of the knowledge they had shared, it was too late. The elves had learned enough, had begun their breeding program, had discovered this world's indigenous human population, and commenced extermination. The unicorns objected, demanded cessation, threatened to close access to their knowledge. The Aen Elle responded with violence. If the unicorns would not cooperate, they would be eliminated as obstacles. Eredin's Red Riders began systematic hunting, made sport of killing creatures whose intelligence exceeded most sentient beings, collected trophies from beings who had trusted them. The war between Aen Elle and unicorns had raged for generations by the time Ciri arrived. Each side knew the other intimately through centuries of conflict. The unicorns understood Aen Elle's civilization from foundation to current expression. They had watched it develop, seen every choice that led to the current state of genocide and slavery. They remembered when the Aen Elle had been merely visitors, remembered when they had seemed reasonable, remembered the precise moment they revealed their true intentions, and they looked at Avallac'h, one of the primary architects of current Aen Elle strategy, keeper of the breeding program, manipulator of the Elder Blood inheritance, and named him after the creature most associated with deception. Foxes in folklore were tricksters appearing across multiple cultures, clever, charming when necessary, capable of elaborate schemes that unfolded over long periods. They survived by being harder to catch than to understand. They lied with such skill that truth and falsehood became indistinguishable even to those actively searching for distinctions. They manipulated through misdirection and half-truth, never stated direct falsehood when omission would serve, framed their schemes in language that suggested mutual benefit while concealing ulterior motives, made victims complicit in their own exploitation through careful presentation of limited options. The fox appeared in human and elven folklore as well, as Reynard the Fox, cunning trickster who survived through wit, as the kitsune of Eastern traditions, shapeshifter who could maintain human form for years, deceiving entire communities, as Tumessian Fox, creature who could never be caught, who escaped every trap through cleverness. The unicorns, beings of equivalent intelligence and far greater moral clarity than the Aen Elle, judged Avallac'h and found him worthy of that name, found it appropriate, found it warning. If beings as sophisticated as the elves, as long-lived and capable of long-term perspective, who had witnessed Aen Elle civilization from outside and found it monstrous, looked at Avallac'h's plans and chose to oppose them despite centuries of cost, that judgment deserves weight. The unicorns did not oppose Avallac'h from ignorance or misunderstanding. They opposed him from full comprehension of what his plans entailed. They had seen it before across their world, watched it unfold in systematic fashion as the Aen Elle established dominance, knew exactly where his careful calculations led, to genocide of indigenous populations, to slavery on industrial scale, to the extinction of entire civilizations reduced to footnotes in Aen Elle historical records, to suffering measured not in individuals but in worlds. They called him Fox because he dressed evil in the language of necessity, made atrocities sound like survival, convinced even himself perhaps that the ends justified any means, that racial preservation superseded all other considerations, that his people's lives mattered more than the lives of those they would destroy to survive. The unicorns had learned through painful experience that nobility of stated purpose did not excuse brutality of method, that claiming to act for survival did not justify genocide, that being long-lived and intelligent didn't grant license to treat other beings as resources to be exploited. They had learned these lessons through watching the Aen Elle, through seeing their own goodwill weaponized against them, through discovering that trust could be exploited as efficiently as any other resource, and they named Avallac'h Fox as warning to their own kind, and as judgment upon his character that would echo across centuries for any with wisdom to hear it. By the time Ciri escaped Tir Nalia, The consequences had propagated across worlds and timelines in ways no calculation could have predicted. Oberon was dead, creating succession crisis and allowing Eredin to seize power through force rather than legitimate transition. The careful political balance Avallac'h had navigated for centuries shattered in one night. Eredin had transformed the Wild Hunt from tool of Aen Elle expansion into personal terror. What had been organized raiding parties became something darker. They hunted not for strategic purpose, but for sport, for slaves, for the joy of causing fear. Ciri had been traumatized, trust burned away by imprisonment and coercion, any possibility of willing cooperation destroyed. She would spend years recovering from what had been done to her, if recovery was even possible. The Aen Elle remained unaware that their rescue would make them accomplices to genocide. That salvation would require participating in the extinction of other worlds' populations. That escape from human persecution would mean perpetrating the same against others. Each action taken in service of long-term survival had generated immediate costs. The mathematical problem of saving the elves had become entangled with chaos, trauma, and moral complexity no calculation could untangle. Perhaps any plan spanning centuries and involving forcible control of beings powerful enough to open gates between worlds was destined to generate consequences beyond prediction. Or perhaps Avallac'h had miscalculated fundamentally by treating individuals as variables rather than as agents capable of resisting, choosing, and forging paths outside his predictions. The mathematics of consequence proved more complex than the mathematics of planning. Variables possessed consciousness, equations developed desires, tools decided they would not be wielded, and the fox, for all his cunning, discovered that some traps caught those who set them. What remains after examining Avallac'h's actions across centuries is not simple judgment, but pattern recognition. He was not villain in the sense of pursuing evil for its own sake. He genuinely believed in saving his people, dedicated 400 years to this purpose, sacrificed personal desires, if he possessed any, to the larger goal of racial survival. But he was also not hero. His methods involved imprisonment, coercion, callous dismissal of autonomy. He participated in or benefited from genocide. He manipulated rather than persuaded. He treated people as means rather than ends. The tragedy lies in how sincerity of belief in righteous cause failed to prevent profound harm. Those who possess certainty in the rightness of their cause often inflict the most systematic damage. They justify atrocity through mathematics. They calculate acceptable losses. They measure individual suffering against collective benefit and decide the equation balances. Those who can calculate outcomes across centuries sometimes forget to calculate the immediate cost to those living in the present. The pain inflicted today does not diminish merely because it serves purposes that will bear fruit in 300 years. Avallac'h was sage, keeper of prophecy, guardian of ancient knowledge accumulated across millennia, scholar who preserved what might otherwise be lost. And he was fox, cunning, manipulative, deceptive in service of goals that might be righteous, might be self-serving, might be both simultaneously and impossible to separate. The mathematics of his planning spanned centuries, 1,500 years of tracking bloodlines, 400 years of personal involvement, decades of careful maneuvering to position Ciri where she could be trapped and controlled. The consequences of his actions will ripple across generations. What he set in motion cannot be easily stopped or redirected. Prophecy, once invoked, runs its course regardless of those who attempted to manage its fulfillment. Whether the prophecy ultimately proves his calculations correct or reveals them as catastrophic miscalculation remains to be seen. The white frost still approaches across millennia. The gates remain sealed. The elder blood persists in Ciri, who escaped his control but cannot escape her nature. But the cost has already been paid by those who had no choice in the equation. By Lara Dorren, dead for loving outside acceptable parameters. By Ciri, imprisoned and coerced, her autonomy dismissed as irrelevant to larger purposes. By enslaved humans in Tir Nalia, their entire civilization reduced to livestock. By the Aen Elle, unaware they were being saved into complicity with atrocity. By those treated as variables rather than people. By those whose suffering was deemed acceptable in service of someone else's survival. By those who existed within the equations but never saw the calculations that determined their fates. That is the final mathematics. The one that perhaps Avallac'h, for all his prophetic sight and centuries of experience, never fully considered. The cost to others, the weight of imposed destiny, the price of treating individuals as means rather than ends. The fox continues his schemes. Events unfold according to patterns he may or may not still control. The prophecy remains unfulfilled or fulfilled in ways no one fully understands. The white frost approaches across millennia, patient and inevitable as mathematics itself. And somewhere in the accumulated consequences, the question remains unanswered. When survival requires such cost, who has the right to calculate, and who must pay the price?